Howdy, howdy, y'all. I am a little late. A lot late. But I'm here. Back with more Cabinet of Curiosities. Where did we leave off? Oh yeah, Smithback got his ass handed to him. Hold on, let me take a sip. Handed to him on a silver platter. Now, Chapter 4. Mandy Eklund climbed the filthy subway stairs to First Street, turned north at Avenue A, and trudged toward Tompkins Square Park. Ahead, the park's anemic trees rose up against a sky faintly smeared with the purple stain of dawn. The morning star, low on the horizon, was fading into oblivion. Mandy pulled her wrap more tightly around her shoulders in a futile attempt to keep out the early morning chill. She felt a little groggy, and her feet ached each time they hit the pavement. It had been a great night at Club Pissoir, though. Music, free... Pissoir, though. Music, free drinks, dancing. The whole Ford crowd had been there, along with a bunch of photographers. The Mademoiselle and Cosmo people. Everyone who mattered in the fashion world. She really was making it. The thought still amazed her. Only 6 months before, she'd been working at Rodney's in Bismarck, giving free makeovers. Then, the right person happened to come through the shop, and now she was on the testing board at the Ford agency. Eileen Ford herself had taken her under her wing. It was all coming together faster than she'd ever dreamed possible. 2 seconds. Her father called almost every day from the farm. It was funny, kind of cute, really, how worried he was about her living in New York City. He thought the place was a den of iniquity. He'd freak if he knew she'd stayed out till dawn. He still wanted her to go to college. And maybe she would. Someday. But right now, she was 18 and having the time of her life. She smiled affectionately at the thought of her conservative old father, riding his John Deere, worrying himself about her. She'd make the call this time. Give him a surprise. She turned onto 7th Street, passing the darkened park, keeping a wary eye out for muggers. New York was a lot safer now, but it was still wise to be careful. She felt into her purse, hand closing comfortably around the small bottle of pepper spray attached to her keychain. There were a couple of homeless sleeping on pieces of cardboard, and a man in a threadbare corduroy suit sat on a bench, drinking and nodding. An early breeze passed through the listless sycamore branches, rattling the leaves. They were just beginning to turn a jaundiced yellow. Once again, she wished her walk-up apartment wasn't so far from a subway station. She couldn't afford cabs. Not yet, anyway. And walking the 9 blocks home at night was a hassle. At first, it had seemed like a cool neighborhood, but the seediness was starting to get to her. Gentrification was creeping in, but not fast enough. The dingy squats and the old hollow buildings, sealed shut with cinder block, were depressing. The Flatiron District would be better, or maybe even Yorkville. A lot of the Ford models, the ones who'd made it, lived up there. She left the park behind and turned up Avenue C. Silent brownstones rose on either side, and the wind sent trash along the gutters with a dry, skittery sound. The faint ammoniac tang of urine floated out from dark doorways. Nobody picked up after their dogs, and she made her way with care through a disgusting minefield of dog shit. This part of the walk was always the worst. She saw, ahead of her, a figure approaching down the sidewalk. She stiffened, considered crossing the street, then relaxed. It was an old man, walking painfully with a cane. As he approached, she could see he was wearing a funny derby hat. His head was bowed, and she could make out its even brim, the crisp black lines of its crown. She didn't recall ever seeing anybody wearing a derby, except in old black-and-white movies. He looked very old-fashioned, shuffling along with cautious steps. She wondered what he was doing out so early. Probably insomnia. Old people had it a lot, she'd heard. Waking up at 4 in the morning, couldn't go back to sleep. She wondered if her father had insomnia. They were almost even now. The old man suddenly seemed to grow aware of her presence. He raised his head and lifted his arm to grasp his hat. He was actually going to tip his hat to her. The hat came up, the arm obscuring everything except the eyes. They were remarkably bright and cold, and they seemed to be regarding her intently. Must be insomnia, she thought. Despite the hour, this old fellow wasn't sleepy at all. "Good morning, miss," said an old, creaky voice. "Good morning," she replied, trying to keep the surprise from her voice. Nobody ever said anything to you on the street. It was so un-New York. It charmed her. As she passed him, she suddenly felt something whip around her neck with horrible speed. She struggled and tried to cry out, but found her face covered with a cloth, damp and reeking with a sickly sweet chemical smell. Instinctively, she tried to hold her breath. Her hands scrabbled in her purse and pulled out the bottle of pepper spray, but a terrible blow knocked it to the sidewalk. She twisted and thrashed, moaning in pain and fear, her lungs on fire. She gasped once, and then all swirled into oblivion. 2 seconds. Did I remember to... I did. That was smart. Chapter 5. In his messy cubicle on the 5th floor of the Times building, Smithback examined with dissatisfaction the list he had handwritten in his notebook. At the top of the list, the phrase Fairhaven's employees had been crossed out. He hadn't been able to get back into Mogan Fairhaven building. Fairhaven had seen to that. Likewise, neighbors had also been crossed out. He'd been given the bum's rush at Fairhaven's apartment building, despite all his best stratagems and tricks. He'd looked into Fairhaven's past, to his early business associates, but they were either full of phony praise or simply refused comment. Next, he checked out Fairhaven's charities. The New York Museum was a dead loss. No one who knew Fairhaven would talk about him, for obvious reasons. But he had more success with one of Fairhaven's other projects, the Little Arthur Clinic for children. If success was the right word for it. The clinic was a small research hospital that cared for sick children with orphaned diseases. Very rare illnesses that the big drug companies had no interest in finding cures for. Smithback had managed to get in posing as himself, a New York Times reporter interested in their work. 2 seconds. back. They had even given him an informal tour. But in the end, that, too, had been a snow job. The doctors, nurses, parents, even the children sang hosanas for Fairhaven. It was enough to make you sick. Turkeys at Thanksgiving, bonuses at Christmas, toys and books for the kids, trips to Yankee Stadium. Fairhaven had even attended a few funerals, which must have been tough. And yet, thought Smithback grumpily, all it proved was that Fairhaven carefully cultivated his public image. The guy was a public relations pro from way back. Smithback had found nothing. Nothing. That reminded him. He turned, grabbed a battered dictionary from a nearby shelf, flipped through the pages until he reached N. Nugatory. Of no importance. Trifling. Smithback put back the dictionary. What was needed here was some deeper digging. Before the time when Fairhaven had gone pro with his life. Back when he was just another pimply high school kid. Fairhaven thought Smithback was just another run-of-the-mill reporter, doing nugatory work. Well, he wouldn't be laughing so hard when he opened his Monday paper. All it took was 10 minutes on the web to hit pay dirt. Fairhaven's class at PS, 1984, up on Amsterdam Avenue, had recently celebrated the 15th anniversary of their graduation. They'd created a web page reproducing their yearbook. Fairhaven hadn't shown up for the reunion, and he might not have even known of the web page. But all the information about him from his old yearbook was posted for all to see. Photos, nicknames, clubs, interests, everything. 2 seconds. There he was, a clean-cut, all-around kid, smiling cockily out of a blurry graduation photograph. He was wearing a tennis sweater and a checked shirt. A typical well-heeled city boy. His father was in real estate, his mother a homemaker. Smithback quickly learned all kinds of things. That he was captain of the swim team, that he was born under the sign of Gemini, that he was head of the debating club, that his favorite rock group was the Eagles, that he played the guitar badly, that he wanted to be a doctor, that his favorite color was burgundy, and that he had been voted most likely to become a millionaire. As Smithback scrolled through the website, the sinking feeling returned. It was all so unspeakably boring. But there was one detail that caught his eye. Every student had been given a nickname, and Fairhaven's was the Slasher. He felt his disappointment abate, just slightly. The Slasher. It would be nice if the nickname turned up a secret interest in torturing animals. It wasn't much, but it was something. And he graduated only 16 years ago. There would be people who remembered him. If there was anything unsavory, Smithback would find it. Let that bastard crack his paper next week and see how fast that smug smile got wiped off. P.S. 1984. Luckily, the school was only a cab ride away. Turning his back on the computer, Smithback stood up and reached for his jacket. The school stood on a leafy Upper West Side block between Amsterdam and Columbus, not far from the museum. A long building of yellow brick, surrounded by wrought iron fence. As far as New York City schools went, it was rather nice. Smithback strode to the front, found it locked. Security, of course, and buzzed. A policeman answered. Smithback flashed his press card, and the cop let him in. It was amazing how the place smelled, just like his own high school. Far away and long ago. And there was the same top paint on the cinder block walls. All school principals must have read the same how-to manual. Smithback thought as the cop escorted him through the metal detector into the principal's office. The principal referred him to Miss Kite. Smithback found her at her desk, working on student assignments between classes. She was a handsome, gray-haired woman, and when Smithback mentioned Fairhaven's name, he was gratified to see the smile he was gratified to see the smile of memory on her face. "Oh, yes," she said. Her voice was kind, but there was no nonsense edge to it that told Smithback that this was no pushover granny. "I remember Tony Fairhaven well, because he was in my first 12th grade class, and he was one of our top students. He was a National Merit Scholar runner-up. Need to practice." Smithback nodded deferentially and jotted a few notes. He wasn't going to tape record this. That was a good way to shut people up. "Tell me about him informally. What was he like?" "He was a bright boy, quite popular. I believe he was the head of the swim team. A good, all-around, hard-working student." "Did he ever get into trouble?" "Sure. They all did." Smithback tried to look casual. "Really?" "He used to bring his guitar to school and play in the halls, which was against regulations. He played very badly, and it was mostly to make the other students laugh." She thought for a moment. "One day, he caused a hall jam." "A hall jam." Smithback waited. "And then?" "We confiscated the guitar, and that ended it. We gave it back to him after graduation." Smithback nodded, the polite smile freezing on his face. "Did you know his parents?" "His father was in real estate, though, of course, it was Tony who really made such a success in the business. I don't remember the mother. Brothers? Sisters?" "At that time, he was an only child. Of course, there was the family tragedy." Smithback involuntarily leaned forward. "Tragedy?" "His older brother, Arthur, died. Some rare disease." Smithback abruptly made the connection. "Did they call him Little Arthur, by any chance?" "I believe they did. His father was Big Arthur. It hit Tony very hard." "When did it happen?" "When Tony was in 10th grade. "So it was his older brother. Was he in school too?" "No. He'd been hospitalized for years. Some very rare and disfiguring disease." "What disease?" "I really don't know." "When you say it hit Fairhaven hard, how so?" "He became withdrawn, antisocial. But he came out of it, eventually." Yes. Let me see." Smithback checked his notes. "Let's see. Any problems with alcohol? Drugs? Delinquency?" Smithback tried to make it sound casual. No. Just the opposite," came the curt reply. The look on the teacher's face had hardened. "Tell me, Mr. Smithback, exactly why are you writing this article?" 2 seconds. Right back. Smithback put on his most innocent face. I'm just doing a little biographical feature on Mr. Fairhaven. You understand. We want to get a well-rounded picture. The good and the bad. Not fishing for anything in particular. Right. I see. Well, Tony Fairhaven was a good boy, and he was very anti-drug, anti-drinking, even anti-smoking. I remember he wouldn't even drink coffee. She hesitated. I don't know. If anything, he might have been a little too good. And it was sometimes hard to tell what he was thinking. He was a rather closed boy. Smithback jotted a few more pro forma notes. Any hobbies? He talked about making money quite a bit. He worked hard after school, and he had a lot of spending money as a result. I don't suppose any of this is surprising, considering what he's done. I've read, from time to time, articles about him, how he pushed through his development, or that, over a neighbor's protests. Oh, I misread. I've read, from time to time, articles about him, how he pushed through this development, or that, over a neighbor's protests. And, of course, I read your piece on the Catherine Street discoveries. Nothing surprising. The boy has grown into the man. That's all. Smithback was startled. She'd given no indication she even knew who he was, let alone read his pieces. By the way, I thought your article was very interesting. And disturbing. Smithback felt a flush of pleasure. Thank you. I imagine that's why you're interested in Tony. Well, rushing in and digging up that site so he could finish his building was just like him. He was always very goal-oriented, impatient to get to the end, to finish, to succeed. I suppose that's why he's been so successful as a developer. And he could be rather sarcastic and impatient with people he considered his inferiors. Right, thought Smithback. What about enemies? Did he have any? Let me see. I just can't remember. He was the kind of boy that was never impulsive, always very deliberate in his actions. Although it seems to me there was something about a girl once. He got into a shoving match and was suspended for the afternoon. No blows were exchanged, though. And the boy? That would have been Joel Amberson. What happened to Joel Amberson? Why, nothing. Smithback nodded, crossed his legs. This was getting nowhere. Time to move in for the kill. Did he have any nicknames? You know how kids always seem to have a nickname in high school. I don't remember any other names. I took a look at the yearbook, posted on your website. The teacher smiled. We started doing that a few years ago. It's proven to be quite popular. No doubt. But in the yearbook, he had a nickname. Really? What was it? The Slasher. Her face furrowed, then suddenly cleared. Ah, yes. That. Smithback leaned forward. That? The teacher gave a little laugh. They had to dissect frogs for biology class. And? Tony was a little squeamish. For 2 days he tried and tried, but he couldn't do it. The kids teased him about it, and somebody started calling him that. The Slasher. It kind of stuck. As a joke, you know. He did eventually overcome his qualms, and got an A in biology, as I recall. But you know how it is once they start calling you a name. Smithback didn't move a muscle. He couldn't believe it. It got worse and worse. The guy was a candidate for beautification. Or beatification. Mr. Smithback? Smithback made a show of checking his notes. Anything else? The kindly gray-haired teacher laughed softly. Look, Mr. Smithback, if it's dirt you're looking for on Tony, and I can see that it is, it's written all over your face. You're just not going to find it. He was a normal, all-around, high-achieving boy who seems to have grown into a normal, all-around, high-achieving man. And now, if you don't mind, I'd like to get back to my grading. Smithback stepped out of PS 1984 and began walking, rather mournfully, in the direction of Columbus Avenue. This hadn't turned out the way he'd planned at all. He'd wasted a colossal amount of time, energy, and effort, and without anything at all to show for it. Was it possible his instincts were wrong? That this was all a wild goose chase? A dead end inspired by a thirst for revenge? But no, that would be unthinkable. He was a seasoned reporter. When he had a hunch, it was usually right. So how was it he couldn't find the goods on Fairhaven? As he reached the corner, his eyes happened to stray toward a newsstand and the front page of a freshly printed New York Post. The headline froze him in his tracks. 2 seconds. Back. Exclusive. Second mutilated body found. The story that followed was bylined by Bryce Harriman. Smithback fumbled in his pocket for change, dropped it on the scarred wooden counter, and grabbed a paper. He read with trembling hands. New York, October 10th. An as yet unidentified body of a young woman was discovered this morning in Tompkins Square Park in the East Village. She is apparently the victim of the same brutal killer who murdered a tourist in Central Park 2 days ago. In both cases, the killer dissected part of the spinal cord at the time of death, removing a section known as the cauda equina, a bundle of nerves at the base of the spinal cord that resembles a horse's tail. The Post has learned. The actual cause of death appears to have been the dissection itself. The mutilation in both cases appears to have been done with care and precision, possibly with surgical instruments. An anonymous source confirmed the police are investigating the possibility that the killer is a surgeon or other medical specialist. The dissection mimics a description of a surgical procedure discovered in an old document in the New York Museum. The document, found hidden in the archives, describes in detail a series of experiments conducted in the late 19th century by an Enoch Lang. These experiments were an attempt by Lang to prolong his own lifespan. On October 1st, 36 alleged victims of Lang were uncovered during the excavation of a building foundation on Catherine Street. Nothing more is known about Lang, except that he was associated with the New York Museum of Natural History. "What we have here is a copycat killer," said Police Commissioner Carl C. Rocker. A very twisted individual read the article about Lang and is trying to duplicate his work. He declined to comment further on any details of the investigation, except to say that more than 50 detectives had been assigned to the case, and that it was being given the highest priority. Smithback let out a howl of anguish. The tourist in Central Park was the murder assignment that, like a complete fool, he turned down. Instead, he had promised his editor Fairhaven's head on a platter. Now, not only did he have nothing to show for his day of pounding the pavement, but he had been scooped in the very story he himself had broken, and by none other than his old nemesis, Bryce Harriman. It was his own head that would be on a platter. Chapter 6. Nora turned off Canal Street into Mott, moving slowly through the throngs of people. It was 7 o'clock on a Friday evening, and Chinatown was packed. Sheets of densely printed Chinese newspapers lay strewn in the gutters. The stalls of the fish sellers were set up along the sidewalks. Vast arrays of exotic-looking fish laid out on ice. In the windows, pressed duck and cooked squid hung on hooks. The buyers, primarily Chinese, pushed and shouted frantically under the curious gaze of passing tourists. 10 Ren's Tea and Ginseng Company was a few hundred feet down the block. She pushed through the door into a long, bright, orderly space. The air of the tea shop was perfumed with innumerable faint scents. At first, she thought the shop was empty, but then, as she looked around once more, she noticed Pendergast at a rear table, nestled between display cases of ginseng and ginger. She could have sworn that the table had been empty just a moment before. "Are you a tea drinker?" he asked as she approached, motioning her to a seat. "Sometimes." Her subway had stalled between stations for 20 minutes, and she'd had plenty of time to rehearse what she would say. She would get it over with quickly and get out. But Pendergast was clearly in no hurry. They sat in silence while he consulted a sheet filled with Chinese ideographs. Nora wondered if it was a list of tea offerings, but there seemed to be far too many items. Surely there weren't that many kinds of tea in the world. There are. Pendergast turned to the shopkeeper, a small, vivacious woman, and began speaking rapidly. I am going to butcher this Chinese. Ni hao, Lao Bin Lang, Li Mama Hamwa. The woman shook her head. Bu Tahashi Lao Yangzi, Shanti Buhao. King Le Da Wuzhang Tawanyan. Kingwe Wo Yibe Wulang Chahamwa. Cha Hao Ma. Chow Hao Ma. Chow Hao Ma. The woman walked away, returning with a ceramic pot from which she poured a minuscule cup of tea. She placed the cup in front of Nora. You speak Chinese? Nora asked. A little Mandarin. I confess to speaking Cantonese somewhat more fluently. Nora fell silent. Somehow, she was not surprised. King's tea, King's tea, of Osmanthus Oolong, said Pendergast, nodding toward her cup. One of the finest in the world, from bushes grown on the sunny sides of the mountains, new shoots gathered only in the spring. Nora picked up the cup. A delicate aroma rose to her nostrils. She took a sip, tasting a complex blend of green tea and other exquisitely delicate flavors. Very nice, she said, putting down the cup. Indeed. Pendergast glanced at her for a moment. Then he spoke again in Mandarin, and the woman filled up a bag, weighed it, and sealed it, scribbling a price on the plastic wrapping. She handed it to Nora. For me? Nora asked. Pendergast nodded. I don't want any gifts from you. Please, take it. It's excellent for the digestion, as well as being a superb antioxidant. Nora took it irritably, then saw the price. Wait a minute. This is $200? It will last 3 or 4 months, said Pendergast. A small price when one considers. Look, said Nora, setting down the bag. Mr. Pendergast, I came here to tell you that I can't work for you anymore. My career at the museum is at stake. A bag of tea isn't going to change my mind, even if it is $200. Pendergast listened attentively, his head slightly bowed. They implied, and the implication was very clear, that I wasn't to work with you anymore. I like what I do. I keep this up, I'll lose my job. I already lost one job when the Lloyd Museum closed down. I can't afford to lose another. I need this job. Pendergast nodded. Brisbane and Calliope gave me the money I need for my carbon dates. I've got a lot of work ahead of me now. I can't spare the time. Pendergast waited, still listening. What do you need me for, anyway? I'm an archaeologist, and there's no longer any site to investigate. You've got a copy of the letter. You're FBI. You must have dozens of specialists at your beck and call. Pendergast remained silent as Nora took a sip of tea. The cup rattled loudly in the saucer when she replaced it. So, she said. Now that's settled. Now, Pendergast spoke. Mary Green lived a few blocks from here, down on Water Street, number 16. The house is still there. It's a 5-minute walk. Nora looked at him, eyebrows narrowing in surprise. It had never occurred to her how close they were to Mary Green's neighborhood. She recalled the note, written in blood. Mary Green had known she was going to die. Her want had been simple, not to die in complete anonymity. Pendergast gently took her arm. "Come," he said. She did not shrug him off. He spoke again to the shopkeeper, took the tea with a slight bow, and in a moment they were outside on the crowded street. They walked down Mott, crossing first Bayard and Chatham Square, entering into a maze of dark, narrow streets abutting the East River. The noise and bustle of Chinatown gave way to the silence of industrial buildings. The sun had set, leaving a glow in the sky that barely outlined the tops of the buildings. Reaching Catherine Street, they turned southeast. Nora glanced over curiously as they passed Henry and the site of Mogan Fairhaven's new residential tower. The excavation was much bigger now. Massive foundations and stem walls rose out of the gloom, rebar popping like reeds from the freshly poured concrete. Nothing was left of the old coal tunnel. Another few minutes, and they were on Water Street. Old manufacturing buildings, warehouses, and decrepit tenements lined the street. Beyond, the East River moved sluggishly, dark purple in the moonlight. The Brooklyn Bridge loomed almost above them, and to its left, the Manhattan Bridge arched across the dark river. Its span of brilliant lights reflected in the water below. Near Market Slip, Pendergast stopped in front of an old tenement. It was still inhabited. A single window glowed with yellow light. A metal door was set into the first-floor facade. Beside it was a dented intercom and a series of buttons. "Here it is," said Pendergast. "Number 16. They stood in the gathering darkness. Pendergast began to speak quietly in the gloom. "Mary Green came from a working-class family. After her father's upstate farm failed, he brought his family down here. He worked as a stevedore on the docks. But both he and Mary's mother died in a minor cholera epidemic when the girl was 15. Bad water. She had a younger brother, Joseph, 7, and a younger sister, Constance, 5. Nora said nothing. Mary Green tried to make in washing and sewing, but apparently it wasn't enough to pay the rent. There was no other work, no way to earn money. They were evicted. Mary finally did what she had to do to support her younger sibling, whom she evidently loved very much. She became a prostitute." "How awful," Nora murmured. "That's not the worst. She was arrested when she was 16. It was probably at that point her two younger siblings became street children. They called them gutter snipes in those days. There's no more record of them in any city files. They probably starved to death. In 1871, it was estimated there were 28,000 homeless children living on the streets of New York. In any case, later, Mary was sent to a workhouse known as the 5 Points Mission. It was basically a sweatshop, but it was better than prison. On the surface, that would have seemed to be Mary Green's lucky break." Pendergast fell silent. A barge on the river gave out a distant, mournful bellow. "What happened to her then?" "The paper trail ends at the lodging-house door," Pendergast replied. He turned to her, his pale face almost luminous in the gloaming. "Enoch Lang, Dr. Enoch Lang, placed himself and his medical expertise at the service of the 5 Points Mission, as well as the House of Industry, an orphanage that stood near where Chatham Square is today. He offered his time pro bono. As we know, Dr. Lang kept rooms on the top floor of Shodham's cabinet throughout the 1870s. No doubt he had a house somewhere else in the city. He affiliated himself with the two workhouses about a year before Shodham's cabinet burned down. We already know from Shodham's letter that Lang committed those murders. No question. Then why do you need my help? There's almost nothing on record about Lang anywhere. I've tried the Historical Society, the New York Public Library, City Hall. It's as if he's been expunged from the historical record, and I have reason to think Lang himself might have eradicated his files. It seems that Lang was an early supporter of the museum and an enthusiastic taxonomist. I believe there may have been papers in the museum concerning Lang, at least indirectly. Their archives are so vast and disorganized that it would be virtually impossible to purge them. Why me? Why doesn't the FBI just subpoena the files or something? Files have a way of disappearing as soon as they are officially requested, even if one knew which files to request. Besides, I've seen how you operate. That kind of competence is rare. Nora merely shook her head. Mr. Puck has been, and no doubt will continue to be, most helpful. And there's something else. Tinbury McFadden's daughter is still alive. She lives in an old house in Peekskill. She's 95, but I understand very much compos mentis. She may have a lot to say about her father. She may have even known Lang. I have a sense she'd be more willing to speak to a young woman like yourself than to an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You still never really explained why you've taken such an interest in this case. The reason for my interest in this case is the interests in this case are unimportant. What is important is that a human being should not be allowed to get away with a crime like this, even if that person is long dead. We do not forgive or forget Hitler. It's important to remember. The past is part of the present. At the moment, in fact, it's all too much a part of the present. You're talking about these two new murders. The whole city was buzzing with the news, and the same words seemed to be on everyone's lips. Copycat killer. Pendergast nodded silently. But do you really think the murders are connected? That there's some madman out there who read Smithback's article and is now trying to duplicate Lang's experiments? I believe the murders are connected, yes. It was now dark. Water Street and the piers beyond were deserted. Nora shuddered again. Look, Mr. Pendergast, I'd like to help, but it's like I said. I just don't think there's anything more I can do for you. Personally, I think you'd do better to investigate the new murders, not the old. That is precisely what I'm doing. The solution to the new murders lies in the old. She looked at him curiously. How so? Now is not the time, Nora. I don't have sufficient information to answer. Not yet. In fact, I may have already said too much. Nora sighed with irritation. Then I'm sorry, but the bottom line is that I simply can't afford to put my job in jeopardy a second time, especially without more information. You understand, don't you? There was a moment's silence. Of course. I respect your decision. Pendergast bowed slightly. Somehow, he managed to give even this simple gesture a touch of elegance. Pendergast asked the driver to let him out a block from his apartment building. As the Rolls-Royce glided silently away, Pendergast walked down the pavement, deep in thought. After a few minutes, he stopped, staring up at his residence. The Dakota, the vast, gargoyle-haunted pile on a corner of Central Park West. But it was not this structure that remained in his mind. It was the small, crumbling tenement at number 16 Water Street, where Mary Green had once lived. The house would contain no specific information. It had not been worth searching. And yet, it possessed something less definable. It was not just the facts and figures of the past that he needed to know, but its shape and feel. Mary Green had grown up there. Her father had been part of that great post-Civil War exodus from the farms to the cities. Her childhood had been hard, but it may well have been happy. Stevedores earned a living wage. Once upon a time, she had played on those cobbles. Her childish shouts had echoed off some of those very bricks. And then cholera carried away her parents and changed her life forever. There were at least 35 other stories like hers, all of which ended so cruelly in that basement charnel. There was a faint movement at the end of the block, and Pendergast turned. An old man in black, wearing a derby hat and carrying a Gladstone bag, was painfully making his way up the sidewalk. He was bowed, moving with the help of a cane. It was almost as if Pendergast's musings had conjured a figure out of the past. The man slowly made his way toward him, his cane making a faint tapping noise. Pendergast watched him curiously for a moment. Then he turned back toward the Dakota, lingering a moment to allow the brisk night air to clear his mind. But there was little clarity to be found. Instead, there was Mary Green, the little girl laughing on the cobbles. Chapter 7. It had been days since Nora was last in her laboratory. She eased the old metal door open and flicked on the lights, pausing. Everything was as she had left it. A white table ran along the far wall, binocular microscope, flotation kit, computer. To the side stood black metal cabinets containing her specimens: charcoal, lithics, bone, other organics. The still air smelled of dust, with a faint overlay of smoke, pinyon juniper. It momentarily made her homesick for New Mexico. What was she doing in New York City, anyway? She was a Southwestern archaeologist. Her brother, Skip, was demanding she come home to Santa Fe on almost a weekly basis. She had told Pendergast she couldn't afford to lose a job here at the museum. But what was the worst that could happen? She could get a position at the University of New Mexico, or Arizona State. They both had superb archaeology departments where she wouldn't have to defend the value of her work to cretins like Brisbane. The thought of Brisbane roused her. Cretins or not, this was the New York Museum. She'd never get another opportunity like this again. Not ever. Briskly, she stepped into the office, closing and locking the door behind her. Now that she had the money for the carbon-14 dates, she could get back to real work. At least that was one thing this whole fiasco had done for her. Get her the money. Now she could prepare the charcoal and organics for shipping to the radiocarbon lab at the University of Michigan. Once she had the dates, her work on the Anasazi-Aztec connection could begin in earnest. She opened the first cabinet and carefully removed a tray containing dozens of stopper test tubes. Each was labeled, and each contained a single specimen, a bit of charcoal and a carbonized seed, a fragment of a corn cob, a bit of wood or bone. She removed 3 of the trays, placing them on the white table. Then she booted her workstation and called up the catalog matrices. Dang it. She began cross-checking, making sure every specimen had the proper label and site location. At $275 a shot for the dating, it was important to be accurate. As she worked, her mind began to wander back to the events of the past few days. She wondered if the relationship with Brisbane could ever be repaired. He was a difficult boss, but a boss nonetheless. And he was shrewd. Sooner or later he'd realize that it would be best for everyone if they could bury the hatchet, and... Nora shook her head abruptly, a little guilty about this selfish line of thought. Smithback's articles hadn't just gotten her into hot water. It apparently inspired a copycat killer the tabloids was already dubbing the Surgeon. She couldn't understand how Smithback thought the article would help. She had already known he was a careerist, but this was too much. A bumbling egomaniac. She remembered her first sight of him in Page, Arizona, surrounded by bimbos in bathing suits, giving out autographs. Trying to, anyway. What a joke. She should have trusted her first impression of him. Her mind wandered from Smithback to Pendergast. A strange man. She wasn't even sure he was authorized to be working on the case. Would the FBI just let one of their agents freelance like this? Why was he so evasive about his interest? Was he just secretive by nature? Whatever the situation, it was most peculiar. She was out of it now, and glad. Very glad. And yet... As she went back to the tubes, she realized she wasn't feeling all that glad. Maybe it was just that the sorting and checking was tedious work. But she realized Mary Green and her sad life was lingering in the back of her mind. The dim tenement, the pathetic dress, the pitiful note. With an effort, she pushed it all away. Mary Green and her family were long gone. It was tragic. It was horrifying. But it was no concern of hers. Sorting completed, she began packing the tubes in their special styrofoam shipping containers. Better to break it down into 3 branches, just in case one got lost. Sealing the containers, she turned to the bills of lading and FedEx shipping labels. A knock sounded at the door. The knob turned, but the locked door merely rattled in its frame. She glanced over. "Who is it?" she called. The hoarse whisper was muffled by the door. "Who?" She felt a sudden fear. No, who? She felt a sudden fear. "Me. Bill." The furtive voice was louder. Nora stood up with a mixture of relief and anger. "What are you doing here? Open up. Are you kidding? Get out of here, now." "Nora, please. It's important." "It's important that you stay the hell away from me. I'm warning you. I've got to talk to you." "That's it? I'm calling security." "No, Nora. Wait." Nora picked up the phone. Dialed. The officer she reached said he would be only too glad to remove the intruder. They would be there right away. "Nora!" Smithback cried. Nora sat down at her workplace, trying to compose her mind. She closed her eyes, ignoring him. Just ignore him. Security would be there in a moment. Smithback continued to plead at the door. "Just let me in for a minute. There's something you have to know. Last night..." She heard heavy footfalls and a firm voice. "Sir, you're in an off-limits area." "Hey, let go! I'm a reporter for..." "You will come with us. Please, sir." There was the sound of a scuffle. "Nora!" A new note of desperation sounded in Smithback's voice. Desperate herself, Nora went to the door, unlocked it, and stuck out her head. Smithback was being held between two burly security men. He glanced at her, cowlick bobbing reproachfully as he tried to extricate himself. "Nora, I can't believe you called security." "Are you all right, miss?" one of them had asked. "I'm fine, but that man shouldn't be here." "This way, sir. We'll walk you to the door." The men started dragging Smithback off. "Unhand me, oaf! I'll report you, Mr. 3467. "Yes, sir. You do that, sir." "Stop calling me sir. This is assault." "Yes, sir." The men, imperturbable, led him down the hall toward the elevator. As Nora watched, she felt a turmoil of conflicting emotion. Poor Smithback. What an undignified exit. But then, he'd brought it on himself, hadn't he? He needed the lesson. He couldn't just show up like this, all mystery and high drama, and expect her to. "Nora!" came the cry from down the hall. "You have to listen! Please! Pendergast was attacked. I heard it on the police scanner. He's in St. Luke's Roosevelt, down on 59th. Then Smithback was gone. His shouts cut off by the elevator doors. Chapter 8. Nobody would tell Nora anything. It was more than an hour before the doctor could see her. At last he showed up in the lounge. Very young, a tired, hunted look in his face, and a 2-day growth of beard. "Dr. Kelly?" he asked the room while looking at his clipboard. She rose, and their eyes met. "How is he?" A wintry smile broke on the doctor's face. "He's going to be fine." He looked at her curiously. "Dr. Kelly, are you a medical archaeologist?" "Oh. And your relationship to the patient?" "A friend. Can I see him? What happened?" "He was stabbed last night." "My God." "Missed his heart by less than an inch. He was very lucky." "How is he?" "He's in—" The doctor paused. The faint smile returned. "Excellent spirits. An odd fellow, Mr. Pendergast. He insisted on a local anesthetic for the operation. Highly unusual. Unheard of, actually. But he refused to sign the consent forms otherwise. Then he demanded a mirror. We had to bring one up from obstetrics. I'd never had quite such a demanding patient. I thought for a moment I had a surgeon on my operating table. They make the worst patients, you know." "What did he want the mirror for?" "He insisted on watching. His vitals were dropping, and he was losing blood. But he absolutely insisted on getting a view of the wound from various angles before he would allow us to operate. Very odd. What kind of profession is Mr. Pendergast in?" "FBI." The smile evaporated. "I see. Well, that explains quite a bit. We put him in a shared room at first. No private ones were available. But then we quickly had to make one available for him. Moved out a state senator to get it." "Why? Did Pendergast complain?" "No. He didn't." The doctor hesitated a moment. "He began watching the video of an autopsy. Very graphic. His roommate naturally objected, but it was really just as well. Because an hour ago, the things started to arrive. He shrugged. He refused to eat hospital food, insisted on ordering in from Balducci's, refused an IV drip, refused painkillers. No Oxycontin, not even Vicodin or Tylenol. Tylenol number 3. He must be in dreadful pain, but doesn't show it. With the new patient right guidelines, my hands are tied. It sounds just like him. The bright side is that the most difficult patients usually make the fastest recovery. I just feel sorry for the nurses. The doctor glanced at his watch. You might as well head over there now. Room 1501. As Nora approached the room, she noticed a faint odor in the air. Something out of place among the aromas of stale food and rubbing alcohol. Something exotic, fragrant. A shrill voice echoed out of the open door. She paused in the doorway and gave a little knock. 2 seconds. The floor of the room was stacked high with old books, and a riot of maps and papers lay across them. Tall sticks of sandalwood incense were propped inside silver cups, sending up slender coils of smoke. That accounts for the smell, Nora thought. A nurse was standing near the bed, clutching a plastic pill box in one hand and a syringe in the other. Pendergast lay on the bed in a black silk dressing gown. The overhead television showed a splayed body, grotesque and bloody, being worked on by no fewer than 3 doctors. One of the doctors was in the middle of lifting a wobbly brain out of the skull. She looked away. On the bedside table was a dish of drawn butter and the remains of cold water lobster tails. "Mr. Pendergast, I insist you take this injection," the nurse was saying. "You've just undergone a serious operation. You must have your sleep." Pendergast withdrew his arm from behind his head, picked up a dusty volume lying atop the sheets, and began leafing through it nonchalantly. "Nurse, I have no intention of taking that. I shall sleep when I'm ready." Pendergast blew dust from the book's spine and turned the page. "I'm going to call the doctor. That is completely unacceptable. And this filth is highly unsanitary." She waved. She waved her hand through the clouds of dust. Pendergast nodded, leafed over another page. The nurse stormed past Nora on her way out. Pendergast glanced at her and smiled. "Ah, Dr. Kelly. Please come in and make yourself comfortable." Nora took a seat in a chair at the foot of the bed. "Are you all right?" He nodded. "What happened?" "I was careless." "But who did it? Where? When?" "Outside my residence," said Pendergast. He held up the remote and turned off the video, then laid the book aside. "A man in black, with a cane, wearing a derby hat. He tried to chloroform me. I held my breath and pretended to faint, then broke away. But he was extraordinarily strong and swift, and I underestimated him. He stabbed me, then escaped." "You could have been killed." "That was the intention." "The doctor said it missed your heart by an inch." "Yes. When I realized he was going to stab me, I directed his hand to a non-vital place. A useful trick, by the way, if you ever find yourself in a similar position." He leaned forward slightly. "Dr. Kelly, I'm convinced he's the same man who killed Doreen Hollander and Mandy Eklund." 2 seconds. And we're back. I'm gonna go back a few pages, bits, words. He leaned forward slightly. Dr. Kelly, I'm convinced he's the man who killed Dorian Hollander and Mandy Eklund. Nora looked at him sharply. What makes you say that? I caught a glimpse of the weapon. A surgeon's scalpel with a moringotomy blade. But why you? Pendergast smiled, but the smile held more pain than mirth. That shouldn't be hard to answer. Somewhere along the way, we brushed up a little too close to the truth. We flushed him out. This is a very positive development. A positive development? You could still be in danger. Pendergast raised his pale eyes and looked at her intently. I am not the only one, Dr. Kelly. You and Mr. Smithback must take precautions. He winced slightly. You should have taken that painkiller. For what I plan to do, it's essential to keep my head clear. People did without painkillers for countless centuries. As I was saying, you should take precautions. Don't venture out alone on the streets at night. I have a great deal of trust in Sergeant O'Shaughnessy. He slipped a card into her hand. If you need anything, call him. I'll be up and about in a few days. She nodded. Meanwhile, it might be a good idea for you to get out of town for a day. There's a talkative, lonely old lady up in Peekskill who would love to have visitors. She sighed. I told you why I couldn't help anymore, and you still haven't told me why you're spending your time with these old murders. Anything I told you now would be incomplete. I have more work of my own to do, more pieces of the puzzle to fit together. But let me assure you of one thing, Dr. Kelly. This is no frivolous field trip. It is vital that we learn more about Enoch Lang. There was a silence. Do it for Mary Green, if not for me. Nora rose to leave. And Dr. Kelly? Yes? Smithback isn't such a bad fellow. I know from experience that he's a reliable man in a pinch. It would ease my mind if, while all this is going on, you two work together. Nora shook her head. No way. Pendergast held up his hand with a certain impatience. Do it for your own safety. And now I need to get back to my work. I look forward to hearing back from you tomorrow. His tone was peremptory. Nora left, feeling annoyed. Yet again, Pendergast had dragged her back into the case, and now he wanted to burden her with that ass, Smithback. Well, forget Smithback. He'd just love to get his hands on part 2 of the story. Him and his Pulitzer. She'd go to Peekskill. Yeah, she'd go to Peekskill, all right. But she'd go by herself. 2 seconds. Chapter 9. The basement room was small and silent. In its simplicity, it resembled a monk's cell. Only a narrow-legged wooden table and stiff, uncomfortable chair broke the monotony of the uneven stone floor, the damp, unfinished walls. A black light in the ceiling threw a spectral blue pall over the 4 items upon the table. A scarred and rotting leather notebook, a lacquer fountain pen, a tan-colored length of India rubber, and a hypodermic syringe. The figure in the chair glanced at each of the carefully aligned items in turn. Then, very slowly, He reached for the hypodermic. The needle glowed with strange enchantment in the ultraviolet light, and the serum inside the glass tube seemed almost to smoke. He stared at the serum, turning it this way and that, fascinated by its eddies, its countless miniature whirls. This was what the ancients had been searching for. The Philosopher's Stone, the Holy Grail, the one true name of God. Much sacrifice had been made to get it, on his part, on the part of the long stream of resources who had donated their lives to its refinement. But any amount of sacrifice was acceptable. Here before him was a universe of life, encased in a prison of glass. His life. And to think it all started with a single material, the neural membrane of the cauda equina, the divergent sheath of spinal ganglia with the longest nerve roots of all, to bathe all the cells of the body with the essence of neurons, the cells that did not die. Such a simple concept, yet so damnably complicated in its development. Complicated. The process of synthesis and refinement was torturous, and yet he took great pleasure in it, just as he did in the ritual he was about to perform. Creating the final reduction, moving from step to step to step, had become a religious experience for him. It was like countless Gnostic keys the believer must perform before true prayer can begin. Or the harpsichordist who works his way through the 29 Goldberg variations before arriving at the final, pure, unadorned true Bach intended. The pleasure of these reflections was troubled briefly by the thoughts of those who would stop him, if they could, who would seek him out, follow the carefully obscured trail to this room, put a halt to his noble work. The most troublesome one had already been punished for his presumption, though not as fully punished as intended. Still, there would be other methods, other opportunities. Placing the hypodermic gently aside, he reached for the leather-bound journal, turning over the front cover. Abruptly, a new smell was introduced into the room. Must. Rot. Decomposition. He was always struck by the irony of how a volume that, over the years, had itself grown so decayed, managed to contain the secrets that banished decay. He turned the pages, slowly, lovingly, examining the early years of painstaking work and research. At last, he reached the end, where the notations were still new and fresh. He unscrewed the fountain pen and laid it by the last entry, ready to record his new observations. He would have liked to linger further, but did not dare. The serum required a specific temperature, and was not stable beyond a brief interval. He scanned the tabletop with a sigh of something almost like regret. Though of course it was not regret, because in the wake of the injection would come nullification of corporeal poisons and oxidants and the arresting of the aging process. In short, that which had evaded the best minds for 36 centuries. More quickly now, he picked up the rubber strap, tied it off above the elbow of his right arm, tapped the rising vein with the side of a fingernail, placed the needle against the antecubital fossa, slid it home, and closed his eyes. Chapter 10. Dang it. Nora walked away from the red gingerbread Peekskill station, squinting against the bright morning sun. It had been raining when she boarded the train at Grand Central, but here, only a few small clouds dotted the blue sky above the old riverfront downtown. 3-story brick buildings were set close together, faded facades looking toward the Hudson. Behind them, narrow streets climbed away from the river toward the public library and city hall. Farther still, perched on the rocky hillside, lay the houses of the old neighborhoods, the narrow lawns dotted with ancient trees. Between the aging structures lay a scattering of smaller and newer houses, a car repair shop, the occasional Spanish-American mini-market. Everything looked shabby and superannuated. It was a proud old town in uncomfortable transition, clutching to its dignity in the face of decay and neglect. She checked the directions Clara McFadden. I'm still out of practice. She checked the directions Clara McFadden had given her over the telephone, and began climbing Central Avenue. She turned right on Washington, her old leather portfolio swinging from one hand, working her way toward Simpson Place. It was a steep climb, and she had found herself panting slightly. Across the river, the ramparts of Bear Mountain could be glimpsed through the trees, a patchwork of autumnal yellows and reds, interspersed with darker strands of spruce and pine. Stands. Clara McFadden's house was a dilapidated Queen Anne, with a slatted mansard roof, gables, and a pair of turrets decorated with oriel windows. The white paint was peeling, a wrap-around porch surrounded the first floor. I skipped a period. Set off by a spindlework phrase. As she walked up the short drive, the wind blew through the trees, sending leaves swirling around her. She mounted the porch and rang the heavy bronze bell. A minute passed, then 2. She was about to ring again, when she remembered the old lady had told her to walk in. She grasped the large bronze knob and pushed. The door swung open with the creak of rarely used hinges. She stepped into an entryway, hanging her coat on a long hook. There was a smell of dust, old fabric, and cats. A worn set of stairs swept upward, and to her right she could see a broad arched doorway, framed in carved oak, leading into what looked like a parlor. A voice, riven with age but surprisingly strong, issued from within. "Do come in," it said. Nora paused at the entrance to the parlor. After the bright day outside, it was shockingly dim, the tall windows covered with thick green drapes ending in gold tassels. As her eyes slowly adjusted, she saw an old woman, dressed in crepe and dark bombazine, ensconced on a Victorian wing chair. It was so dark that at first all Nora could see was a white face and white hands, hovering as if disconnected in the dimness. The woman's eyes were half closed. "Do not be afraid," said the disembodied voice from the deep chair. Nora took another step. The white hand moved, indicating another wing chair, draped with a laced antimacassar. "Sit down." Nora took a seat gingerly. Dust rose from the chair. There was a rustling sound as a black cat shot from behind a curtain and disappeared into the dim recesses of the room. "Thank you for seeing me," Nora said. The bombazine crackled as the lady raised her head. "What do you want, child?" The question was unexpectedly direct, and the tone of the voice behind it sharp. "Miss McFadden, I wanted to ask you about your father, Tinber McFadden." "My dear, you're going to have to tell me your name. My dear, you're going to have to tell me your name again. I'm an old lady with a fading memory. Nora Kelly." The old woman's claw reached out and pulled the chain of a lamp that stood beside her chair. It was a heavy tasseled lampshade, and it threw out a dim yellow light. Now Nora could see Clara McFadden more clearly. Her face was ancient and sunken, pale veins showing through parchment paper skin. The lady examined her for a few minutes with a pair of glittering eyes. I need to work on precise and constant pronunciation. I can't speak. Pronunciation of names. The lady examined her for a few minutes with a pair of glittering eyes. "Thank you, Miss Kelly," she said, turning off the lamp again. "What exactly do you want to know about my father?" Nora took a folder out of the portfolio, squinting through the dimness of the questions she'd scribbled on the train north from Grand Central. She was glad she'd come prepared. The interview was becoming unexpectedly intimidating. The old woman picked up something from a small table beside the wing chair, an old-fashioned pint bottle with a green label. She poured a bit of liquid into a teaspoon, swallowed it, replaced the spoon. Another black cat, or perhaps the same one, leapt into the old lady's lap. She began stroking it, and it rumbled with pleasure. "Your father was a curator at the New York Museum of Natural History. He was a colleague of John Canady Schodom, who owned a cabinet of curiosities in Lower Manhattan." There was no response from the old lady. "And he was acquainted with a scientist by the name of Enoch Lang." Miss McFadden seemed to grow very still. Then she spoke with acidic sharpness, her voice cutting through the heavy air. It was as if the name had woken her up. "Lang? What about Lang?" "I was curious if you knew anything about Dr. Lang, or had any letters or papers relating to him." "I certainly do know about Lang," came the shrill voice. "He's the man who murdered my father." Nora sat in stunned silence. There was nothing about a murder in anything she had read about McFadden. "I'm sorry?" she said. "Oh, I know they all said he merely disappeared. But they were wrong." "How do you know this?" There was another rustle. "How? Let me tell you how." Miss McFadden turned on the light again, directing Nora's attention to a large, old framed photograph. It was a faded portrait of a young man in a severe, high-buttoned suit. He was smiling, 2 silver front teeth gleaming out of the frame. A roguish eye patch covered one eye. The man had Clara McFadden's narrow forehead and prominent cheekbones. She began to speak, her voice unnaturally loud and angry. "That was taken shortly after my father lost his right eye in Borneo. He was a collector, you must understand. As a young man, he spent several years in British East Africa. He built up quite a collection of African mammals and artifacts collected from the natives. When he returned to New York, he became a curator at the new museum just started by one of his fellow Lyceum members, the New York Museum of Natural History. It was very different back then, Miss Kelly. Most of the early museum curators were gentlemen of leisure, like my father. They did not have systematic scientific training. They were amateurs in the best of the word. My father was always interested in oddities, queer things. You are familiar, Miss Kelly, with the Cabinet of Curiosities." "Yes," Nora said, as she scribbled notes as quickly as she could. She wished she had brought a voice recorder. "There were quite a few in New York at the time, but the New York Museum quickly started putting them out of business. It became my father's role at the museum to acquire these bankrupt cabinet collections. He corresponded with many of the cabinet owners, the Delacourt family, Phineas Barnum, the Cadwallader brothers. One of these cabinet owners was John Canady Schodom." The old lady poured herself another spoonful from the bottle. In the light, Nora could make out the label. Lydia Pinkham's Vegetable Tonic. Nora nodded. "J.C. Shodom's Cabinet of Natural Productions and Curiosities." "Precisely." There was only a small circle of scientific men in those days, and they all belonged to the Lyceum. Men of varying abilities, I might add. Shodom belonged to the Lyceum, but he was as much a showman as he was a scientist. He had opened a cabinet down on Catherine Street, where he charged a minimal admission. It was mostly patronized by the lower classes. Unlike most of his colleagues, Shodom had these notions of bettering the plight of the poor through education. That's why he situated his cabinet in such a disagreeable neighborhood. He was especially interested in using natural history to inform and educate the young. In any case, he needed help with identifying and classifying his collections, which he had acquired from the family of a young man who had been killed by natives in Madagascar. Alexander Marissus. There was a rustle from the old lady. Once again she extinguished the light, shrouding the room in darkness, throwing the portrait of her father into shadow. "You seem to know a great deal about this, Miss Kelly," Clara McFadden said suspiciously. "I hope I am not annoying you with my story." "Not at all. Please go on." Shodom's was a rather wretched cabinet. My father helped him from time to time, but it was burdensome to him. It was not a good collection, very haphazard, not systematic. To lure in the poor, especially the urchins, his exhibits tended toward the sensational. There was even something he called a gallery of unnatural monstrosities. It was, I believe, inspired by Madame Tussaud's Chamber of Horrors. There were rumors that some people who went into that gallery never came out again. All rubbish, of course, most likely cooked up by Shodom to increase foot traffic. Clara McFadden removed a lace handkerchief and coughed into it. It was around that time a man named Lang joined the Lyceum. Enoch Lang. Her voice conveyed a depth of hatred. Nora felt her heart quicken. "Did you know Lang?" "My father talked about him a great deal, especially toward the end. My father, you see, had a bad eye and bad teeth. Lang helped him get some silver bridge work and a special pair of eyeglasses with an unusually thick lens. He seemed to be something of a polymath." She tucked the handkerchief back into some fold of her clothing, took another spoonful of the elixir. "It was said he came from France, a small mountain town near the Belgian border. There was talk that he was a baron, born into a noble family. These scientists are all gossips, you know. New York City at the time was a very provincial place, and Lang made quite an impression. No one doubted he was a very learned man. He called himself a doctor, by the way, and it was said he had been a surgeon and a chemist." She made a vinegary sound. Motes drifted in the heavy air. The cat's purr rumbled on endlessly, like a turbine. The strident voice cut the air again. Shodom was looking for a curator for his cabinet. Lang took an interest in it, although it was certainly the poorest curatorial appointment among the cabinets of curiosities. Nevertheless, Lang took room on the top floor of the cabinet. So far, all this matched the details in Shodom's letter, provided in Shodom's letter. "And when was this?" Nora asked. "In the spring of 1870. "Did Lang live at the cabinet?" "A man of Lang's breeding, living in the 5 Points? Certainly not. But he kept to himself. He was a strange, elusive man, very formal in his diction and mannerisms. No one, not even my father, knew where he lived. Lang did not encourage intimacy." He spent most of his time at Shodham's, or the Lyceum. As I recall, his work at Shodham's cabinet was originally supposed to last only a year or two. At first, Shodham was very pleased with Lang's work. Lang catalogued the collection, would up label copy for everything. But then, something happened. My father never knew what. And Shodham seemed to grow suspicious of Lang. Shodham wanted to ask him to leave, but was reluctant. Lang paid handsomely for the use of the third floor, and Shodham needed the money. What kind of experiments did Lang perform? I expect the usual. All scientific men had laboratories. My father had one. You said your father never knew what made Shodham suspicious. That would mean McFadden never read the letter hidden in the elephant's foot box. That's correct. My father didn't press him on the subject. Shodham had always been a rather eccentric man, prone to opium and fits of melancholy. My father suspected he might be mentally unstable. Then, one summer evening in 1881, Shodham's cabinet burned. It was such a fierce fire that they found only a few crumbling remains of Shodham's bones. It was said that the fire started on the first floor. A faulty gas lamp. Another bitter noise. But you think otherwise? My father became convinced that Lang started that fire. Do you know why? The lady slowly shook her head. He did not confide in me. After a moment, she continued. It was around the time of the fire, that Lang stopped attending the meetings at the Lyceum. He stopped coming to the New York Museum. My father lost touch with him. He seemed to disappear from scientific circles. 30 years must have passed before he resurfaced. When was this? During the Great War. I was a little girl at the time. My father married late, you see. He received a letter from Lang, a very friendly letter, wishing to renew the acquaintance. My father refused. Lang persisted. He began coming to the museum, attending my father's lectures, spending time in the museum's archives. My father became disturbed, and, after a while, even frightened. He was so concerned, I believe he even consulted fellow Lyceum members he was close to on the subject. James Henry Percival and Dumont Burleigh are two names that come to mind. They came to the house more than once, shortly before the end. I see. Nora scribbled some more notes. But you never met Lang. There was a pause. I met him once. He came to our house late one night, with a specimen from my father, and was turned away at the door. He left the specimen behind. A graven artifact from the South Seas, of little value. And? My father disappeared the next day. And you're convinced it was Lang's doing? Yes. God dang it. How? The old lady patted her hair, her sharp eyes fixed on hers. My dear child, how could I possibly know that? But why would Lang murder him? I believe my father found out something about Lang. Didn't the museum investigate? No one had seen Lang in the museum. No one had seen him visit my father. There was no proof of anything. Neither Percival nor Burleigh spoke up. The museum found it easier to smear my father's name, to imply that he ran away for some unknown reason, than to investigate. I was just a girl at the time. When I grew older and demanded a reopening of the case, I had nothing to offer. I was rebuffed. And your mother? Was she suspicious? She was dead by that time. Dang it. What happened to Lang? After his visit to my father, nobody ever saw or heard from him again. Nora took a breath. What did Lang look like? Clara McFadden did not answer immediately. I'll never forget him, she said at last. Have you read Poe's Fall of the House of Usher? There's a description in the story that, when I came upon it, struck me terribly. It seemed to describe Lang precisely. It stayed with me to this day. I can still quote the odd line of it from memory. A cadaverousness of complexion, an eye large, liquid, and very luminous, finely molded chin, speaking in its want of prominence, of a want of moral energy. Lang had blonde hair, blue eyes, an aquiline nose, old-fashioned black coat, formally dressed. That's a very vivid description. Lang was the kind of person who stayed with you long after he was gone. And yet, you know, it was his voice I remember most. No, and yet, you know, it was his voice I remember most. It was low, resonant, strongly accented, with a peculiar quality of something like two people speaking in unison. The gloom that filled the parlor seemed inexplicably to deepen. Nora swallowed. She had already asked all the questions she had planned to. Thank you very much for your time, Miss McFadden, she said as she rose. Why did you bring all this up now? The old lady asked abruptly. Nora realized she must not have seen the newspaper article or heard anything about the recent copycat killings of the surgeon. She wondered just what she should say. She looked about the room. Dark, frozen in shadowy Victorian clutter. She did not want to be the one to upset this woman's world. I am researching the early cabinets of curiosities. The old lady transfixed her with a glittering eye. An interesting subject, child, and perhaps a dangerous one. Chapter 11. Special Agent Pendergast lay in the hospital bed, motionless save for his pale eyes. He watched Nora Kelly leave the room and close the door. He glanced over at the wall clock. 9 p.m. precisely. A good time to begin. He thought back over each word Nora had uttered during her visit, looking for any trivial fact or passing reference that he might have overlooked on first hearing. But there was nothing more. Her visit to Peekskill had confirmed his darkest suspicion. Pendergast had long believed Lang killed Shodom and burned the cabinet. And he felt sure that McFadden's disappearance was also at the hands of Lang. No doubt Shodom had challenged Lang shortly after placing his letter in the elephant's foot box. Lang had murdered him and covered it up with fire. Yet the most pressing questions remained. Why had Lang chosen the cabinet as his base of operations? Why did he begin volunteering his service at the houses of industry a year before killing Shodom? And where did he relocate his laboratory after the cabinet burned? In Pendergast's experience, serial killers were messy. They were incautious. They left clues. But Lang was, of course, very different. He was not, strictly speaking, a serial killer. He had been remarkably clever. Lang had left a kind of negative imprint wherever he went. The man seemed defined by how little was known about him. There was more to be learned, but it was deeply hidden in the masses of information strewn about his hospital room. There was only one way to coax this information out. Research alone would not suffice. And then there was the growing problem of his increasing lack of objectivity regarding this case, his growing emotional involvement. If he did not bring himself sharply under control, if he did not reassert his habitual discipline, he would fail. And he could not fail. Pendergast's gaze shifted to the massing of books, maps, and old periodicals that filled half a dozen surgical carts in the room. His eyes moved from surface to tottering surface. The single most important piece of paper lay on his bedside table, the plan for Shodham's cabinet. One last time, he picked it up and gazed at it, memorizing every detail. The seconds ticked on. He laid down the yellowing plat. It was time. But first, something had to be done about the intolerable landscape of noise that surrounded him. After his condition was upgraded from serious to stable, Pendergast had himself transferred from St. Luke's Roosevelt to Lenox Hill Hospital, the old facility on Lexington Avenue at the thickest walls of any building in the city, save for his own Dakota. Even here, however, he was assaulted by sounds. The bleat of the blood oxygen meter above his bed, the gossiping voices of the nurses' station, the hissing and beepings of the telemetry machines and ventilators, the anecdotal patients snoring in the adjacent rooms, the rumble of the forced air ducts deep in the walls and ceiling. There was nothing he could do that would physically stop these sounds, yet they could be made to disappear through other means. It was a powerful mind game he had developed, an adaptation of Shangran, an ancient Bhutanese Buddhist meditative practice. Pendergast closed his eyes. He imagined a chessboard inside his head, on a wooden table, standing in a pool of yellow light. Then he created 2 players. The first player made his opening move. The second followed. A game of speed chess ensued. And then another, and another. The 2-player strategies, forming adaptive counterattacks. Inverted Hanem, 2-knight defense, Vienna Gambit. One by one, the more distant noises dropped away. When the final game ended in a draw, Pendergast dissolved the chess set. Then, in the darkness of his mind's eye, he created 4 players, seated around a card table. Pendergast had always found bridge a nobler and subtler game than chess, but he rarely played it with others because, outside of his late family, he had found few worthy partners. Now the game began. Each player ignorant of all but his own 13 cards, each player with his own strategies and intellectual capabilities. The game began with roughs and slams and deep finesses. Pendergast toyed with the players, shifting Blackwood, Gerber, and Stamen conventions, positioning a forgetful declarer, misunderstood signals between east and west. By the time the first rubber was completed, all distractions were gone. The noises had ceased. In his mind, only a profound silence reigned. Pendergast turned further inward. It was time for the memory crossing to begin. Several minutes of intense mental concentration passed. Finally, he felt ready. In his mind's eye, he rose from his bed. He felt light, airy, like a ghost. He saw himself walk through the empty hospital corridors, down the stairwell across the arched foyer, and out onto the wide front steps of the hospital. Only the building was no longer a hospital. 120 years before, it had been as the New York rest home for consumptives. Pendergast stood on the steps for a moment, glancing around in the gathering dusk. To the west, toward Central Park, the Upper East Side had become a patchwork of hog farms, wildlands, and rocky eminences. Small groups of hovels sprouted up here and there, huddled together as if for protection against the elements. Gas lamps stood along the avenue, infrequent at this far north of the populace downtown, throwing small circles of light down into the dusky macadam, or macedum. The prospect was vague, indistinct. Detail of this location was unimportant. Pendergast did, however, allow himself to sample the air. It smelled strongly of coal smoke, damp earth, and horse manure. He descended the steps, turning onto 76th Street, and walked east toward the river. Here it was more thickly settled. Newer brownstones abutting old wood and frame structures. Carriages swayed down the straw-strewn street. People passed him silently, the men dressed in long suits with thin lapels, women in bustles and veiled hats. At the next intersection, he boarded a streetcar, paying 5 cents for the ride down to 42nd Street. There, he transferred to the Bowery and 3rd Avenue elevated railway, paying another 20 cents. This extravagant price ensured him a palace car, with curtained windows and plush seats. The steam locomotive heading the train was named the Chauncey M. Depew. As it hurtled southward, Pendergast sat without moving in his velveteen chair. Slowly, he allowed sound to intrude once more into his world. First the clatter of the wheels on the tracks, and then the clatter of his passengers. They were engrossed with the concerns of 1881, the President's recovery and the imminent removal of the pistol ball, the Columbia Yacht Club sailing regatta on the Hudson earlier that afternoon, the miraculous curative properties of the Wilsonia magnetic garment. There were still gaps, of course, hazy dark patches, like fog, about which Pendergast had little or no information. No memory crossing was ever complete. There were details of history that had been irrevocably lost. When the train at last reached the lower stretches of the Bowery, Pendergast disembarked. He stood on the platform a moment, looking around a little more intently now. The elevated tracks were erected over the sidewalks, rather than along the middle of the street, and the awnings below were covered in a greasy film of oil drippings and ash. The Chauncey M. Depew gave a shriek, beginning its furious dash to the next stop. Smoke and hot cinders belched from its stack, scattering into the leaden air. He descended skeletal wooden stairs to ground level, alighting outside a small shop. He glanced at its signboard. George Washington Apicus, physiognomic operator and professor of tonsorial art. The broad thoroughfare before him was a sea of bobbing plug hats. Trams and horse cars went careening down the center of the road. Peddlers of all kinds jostled the narrow sidewalk, crying out their trade to all who would listen. "Pots and pans!" called a tinker. "Bend your pots and pans!" A young woman, trundling a steaming cauldron on wheels, cried, "Oysters! Here's your brave, good oysters!" At Pendergast's left elbow, a man selling hot corn out of a baby's perambulator fished out an ear, smeared it with a butter-soaked rag, and held it out invitingly. Pendergast shook his head and eased his way into the milling crowd. He was jostled. There was a momentary fog, a loss of concentration, and then Pendergast recovered. The scene returned. He moved south, gradually bringing all 5 senses fully alive to his surroundings. The noise was almost overwhelming. Clattering horseshoes, countless snatches of music and songs, yelling, screaming, whinnying, cursing. The air was supercharged with the odors of sweat, dung, cheap perfume, and roasting meats. Down the streets at 41 Bowery, Buffalo Bill was playing in the Scout of the Plains Stage show at the Windsor. Several other theaters followed. Huge signs advertising current performances. Fedora, Peck's Bad Boy, The darkness to the north. Kit, the Arkansas traveler. A blind Civil War veteran lay between two entrances. Cap held out imploringly. Pendergast glided past with barely a glance. At a corner, he paused to get his bearings. Then turned onto East Broadway Street. After the frenzy of Bowery, he entered a more silent world. He moved past the myriad shops of the old city, shuttered and dark at this hour. Saddleries, millinery shops, pawnbrokers, slaughterhouses. Some of these buildings were distinct. Others, places Pendergast had not succeeded in identifying, were vague and shadowy, shrouded in that same indistinct fog. At Catherine Street, he turned toward the river. Unlike on East Broadway, all the establishments here, grog shops, sailors' lodging houses, oyster cellars, were open. Lamps cast lurid red stripes out into the street. A brick building loomed at the corner, long and low, streaked with soot. Its grand cornices and arched lintels spoke of a building. Cornices, not cornices. It's a medical condition. Done in a poor imitation of the neo-Gothic style. A wooden sign, gold letters edged in black, hung over the door. J.C. Shodham's Cabinet of Natural Productions and Curiosities. A trio of bare electric bulbs in metal cages illuminated the doorway, casting a harsh glare onto the street. Shodham's was open for business. A hired hawker shouted at the door. Pendergast could not catch the words above the noise and bustle. A large signboard standing on the pavement in front advertised the featured attractions. See the double-brained child and visit our new annex showing bewitching female bathers in real water. Pendergast stood on the corner, the rest of the city fading into fog as he focused his concentration on the building ahead, meticulously reconstructing every detail. Slowly, the walls came into sharper focus. The dingy windows, the interiors, the bizarre collections, the maze of exhibit halls. As his mind integrated and shaped the vast quantity of information he had amassed. When he was ready, he stepped forward and queued up. He paid his 2 pennies to a man in a greasy stovepipe hat and stepped inside. A low foyer greeted his eye, dominated on the far side with a mammoth skull. Standing next to it was a moth-eaten Kodiak bear, and Native American birch bark canoe, a petrified log. His eyes traveled around the room. The large thigh bone of an antediluvian monster stood against the far wall, and there were other eclectic specimens laid out, helter-skelter. The better exhibits, he knew, were deeper inside the cabinet. Corridors ran off to the left and right, leading to halls packed with teeming humanity. In a world without movies, television, or radio, and where travel was an option only for the wealthiest, the popularity of the diversion was not surprising. Pendergast bore left. The first part of the hall consisted of systematic collections of stuffed birds, laid out on shelves. This exhibit, a feeble attempt to insinuate a little education, held no interest to the crowd, which streamed past on way to less edifying exhibits ahead. The corridor debouched into a large hall, the air hot and close. In the center stood what appeared to be a stuffed man, brown and wizened, with severely bowed legs, gripping a post. The label pinned below it read, "Pygmy man of darkest Africa, who lived to be 345 years of age before death by snakebite." Closer inspection revealed it to be a shaved orangutan, doctored to look human, apparently preserved through smoking. It gave off a fearful smell. Nearby was an Egyptian mummy, standing against the wall in a wooden sarcophagus. There was a mounted skeleton missing its skull, labeled Remains of the Beautiful Countess Adele de Brissac, executed by guillotine, Paris, 1789. Next to it was a rusty piece of iron, dabbed with red paint, marked, The Blade That Cut Her. Pendergast stood at the center of the hall and turned his attention to the noisy audience. He found himself mildly surprised. There were many more young people than he had assumed, as well as a greater cross-section of humanity from high to low. Young bloods and fancy men strolled by, puffing on cigars, laughing condescendingly at the exhibits. A group of tough-looking youths swaggered past, sporting the red flannel firemen's shirts, broad-clothed pantaloons, and greased soap-lock hair that identified them as Bowery boys. There were workhouse girls, whores, urchins, street peddlers, and barmen. I skipped over an and. It was, in short, the same kind of crowd that thronged the streets outside. Now that the workday was done for many, they came to Shotems for an evening's entertainment. The 2-penny admission was within reach for all. Of all. 2 doors at the far end of the hall led to more exhibits. One to the bewitching ladies, the other marked Gallery of Unnatural Monstrosities. The latter was marked in dark, and it was the exhibit that Pendergast had come to see. The sounds of the crowds were muffled here, and there were fewer visitors, mostly nervous, gaping youngsters. The carnival atmosphere had changed into something quieter, more eerie. The darkness, the closeness, the stillness, all conspired to create the effect of fear. At the first turn of the gallery stood a table on which was a large jar of thick glass, stoppered and sealed, containing a floating human baby. 2 miniature, perfectly formed arms stuck out from its forehead. Pendergast peered close and saw that, unlike many of the other exhibits, this one had not been doctored. He passed on. There was a small alcove containing a dog with a cat's head. This one clearly fake, the sewing marks visible through the thinning hair. It stood next to a giant clam, propped open, showing a skeletonized foot inside. The label copy told the gruesome story of the hapless pearl diver. Around another corner, there was a great miscellany of objects and jars of formaldehyde, a Portuguese man-o'-war, a giant rat from Sumatra, a hideous brown thing the size of a flattened watermelon, marked liver from a woolly mammoth frozen in Siberian ice. Next to it was a Siamese-twinned giraffe fetus. The next turn revealed a shelf with a human skull with a hideous bony growth on the forehead, labeled The Rhinoceros Man of Cincinnati. Pendergast paused, listening. Now that the sounds of the crowd were very faint, and he was alone, beyond the darkened hall made one last... Now that the sound of the crowd were very faint, and he was alone. Beyond, the darkened hall made one last sharp turn. An elaborately stylized arrow pointed toward an unseen exhibit around the corner. A sign read, Visit Wilson one-handed, for those who dare. Pendergast glided around the corner. Here, it was almost silent. At the moment, there were no other visitors. The hall terminated in a small alcove. In the alcove was a single exhibit, a glass case containing a desiccated head. The shriveled tongue still protruded from the mouth, looking like a cherry root clamped between the twisted lips. Next to it lay what appeared to be a dried sausage, about a foot long, with a rusty hook attached to one end by leather straps. Next to that, the frayed end of a hangman's noose. A label identified them. The head of the notorious murderer and robber, Wilson One-Handed, hung by the neck until dead, Dakota Territory, July 4th, 1864. The noose from which he was swung, the forearm stump and hook of Wilson one-handed, which brought in a bounty of $1,000. Pendergast examined the cramped room. It was isolated and very dark. It was cut off from the view of other exhibits by a sharp turn of the corridor. It would comfortably admit only one person at a time. A cry for help here would be unheard, out in the main galleries. The little alcove ended in a cul-de-sac. As Pendergast stared at it, pondering, the wall wavered, then disappeared, as fog once again enshrouded his memory construct, and the mental image fell away. But it did not matter. He had seen enough, threaded his way through sufficient passages to understand. And now, at last, he knew how Lang had procured his victims. I feel that is a fun way and a fun place to pause. I realize this is about as short as the last stream, but I think that is a really nice way to leave y'all on a hook. And I shall leave you all on a really nice hook. For next Monday, I shall read for a bit longer. Give you more meat to chew on, little fat to gnaw. But with that, I will wish you all a very pleasant good night and very sweet dreams. This is the Miss Willow Knight signing off.